On behalf of the Office of Research, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Young, who's going to speak to us. He's co-program head of the Justice Studies program in the School of Peace and Conflict Management, and the title of his presentation is Beyond a Place to Stay, Addictions, Mental Health, and Homelessness in the Northwest Territories. He'll probably talk for 45, 50 minutes and then open it up for questions at the end. So join me in welcoming Michael. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I know that you have limited time and it's valuable, and I feel honored that you're here. I'll go through the presentation fairly quickly so that we get some questions at the end. And if you have questions along the way, please hang on to them. I'll do my best at the end to pull together whatever information you're looking for and what I can do. I guess just to set up the context, in that in the Arctic, and what they call is at life above 60, 60 degrees into the Arctic Circle, the Western influence is not that old. It's quite recent. In fact, the communities that we're talking about for the most part are 50 years old. That's about how long it's been since they've come off the land and are now living in settlements of sorts. They're not reserves as such, the way that the land negotiations have been worked out with the federal government, but they are somewhat confined, to say the least. So old meets new, or past meets present. So it's no surprise to us that in the 1990s we see an increase in homelessness in the Arctic, and we see it in remote communities generally across North America and even Western Europe. Visible homelessness is generally not something we see in remote communities and rural communities because it's considered not to be possible. How is it in a small community that you can have such poverty or such problems that people are not able to find a place to stay? What happens to their families? What's their role? What is the community doing? What kind of resources are available? Inuvik is situated in the Beaufort Delta, and our thinking here is that there's migration from the outside communities, and I have a map that'll show you those communities, migration from those communities into the larger center of Inuvik, for reasons probably related to services and also being kicked out, burning bridges, etc., not welcome in their community anymore. In the Arctic generally, and in places like even like Inuvik, there are very limited services. The big service provider closest to Inuvik would be Yellowknife. The only thing that Inuvik has at the moment is a police station, a hospital, one shelter, a transitional home, and space. So we're curious about what roles that substance abuse and mental health lead into what we'll call pathways to homelessness. Do they complement? Do they cause? Are they related? What's the connection? And if so, what kind of services are there? What kind of services are missing? What kind of services might be implemented given resources? So, roughly 3,500 people living in the town of Inuvik. Almost 2/3 of them Aboriginal. It's a resource extraction community. That's why it was built. It is at one point considered to be an engineering marvel. They have services above ground because it's built on permafrost. There's nothing that can be buried other than pilings into the ground to hit to past permafrost for building. At the moment, it's in a bust cycle. Resource extraction has stopped since 2008 when the economic crunch hit. Petroleum development in the future is not even on the horizon, and to make things worse, the natural gas that the town is depending on for living has been contaminated with water, and therefore they are now trucking in propane from the south to the city, or the town, to make synthetic natural gas. So as a result, people there, their hydro bills, power bills have doubled. So the average household now pays $1,500 a month for heating. So services, one shelter, one transition house, an RCMP station, which acts as a de facto shelter, which I'll refer to in a moment. There's a hospital, actually a well-equipped hospital, but it doesn't have long-term care. Long-term services available for the addicted or for the mentally ill either. They have a psychiatrist who comes into town once every 3 weeks, and in the meantime, people do teleconferencing through the health services. So these are the communities in the Beaufort Delta. And I do have a map to show where these things might be. I'd try to pronounce them, but I won't insult the language too much. So the area we're referring to here, I think this is the pointer, yes. How's it up in here? And for you over there, up in that area there. Close to the North Pole, closer to the magnetic North Pole. And a bit of a closer look at the communities. You can see Inuvik is situated in the delta itself. And the contributing communities that we're talking about for persons would be Sax Harbor, Tuktoyaktuk, Aklavik, Sigachik, Fort McPherson, Paulatuk, and Witahuktuk. I believe this is how it's pronounced. Moving on. So, assuming the in-migration of homeless men and women, that's our working assertion. Mental health and addiction issues are common with the homeless population. There is not much for supportive housing. The needs of people are not known for the most part. It's not mapped. My digging in statistics and working through the health authority there, I found very little of information that actually charted people's health conditions. There's an issue of post-traumatic stress and what they call intergenerational trauma from the residential school experience, and also just the removal or the transition from a culture that primarily followed protein to being stuck in an urban, quasi-urban context. And the residential school experience does come to light as a possible influence or contributor to the addiction issues, which also get exacerbated in violence in the home. The list goes on. So we employed a community-based research methodology because we want to use, in fact, we want to be integrated with the people that we're researching with. So we're trying to avoid this outside-in method, which we can't avoid altogether, but we can certainly minimize the type of foreignness that we bring with us. And I stand out when I go into the community, you know. I look a little different. So the Inuvik Interagency Committee contacted me to submit a research intent, which I did. I then engaged in some preliminary research to find out what was going on in the community, and by doing so, I engaged the services and the help of those agencies, including our Office of Research, would help with some funding. And the IIC, the Interagency Committee, has about 30 members in it, 30 agencies or people that are interested. That is the hub or the strength of the community with regards to social support structures of just about every nature. It does include members of the police, the hospital, the Inuvialuit Corporation, the Gwich'in Tribal Council, anybody that has an interface with human beings. So we approached the issue of homelessness broadly and basically decided that taking the UN definition without a permanent address would be the best vote for us as far as being able to access the population. What are the gaps in mental health and addiction services? And what are those needs resulting from the gaps? These sort of focusing questions came out of our initial research in the community with the agencies, primarily the IIC and the people affiliated with it. The idea at the end of this project, we hope, is to make recommendations about what services might be possible to provide given the context. Now, it's given a very minimal mandate because this funding comes from CIHR and HRSDC. I have a very minimal mandate with regards to recommendations that I can make at the community level. In other words, they have to make do with what they've got because there is no more money. So recommendations will be quite Spartan in that sense. So 5 elements to the research that we did was the initial contact, of course, trying to get some data on what was happening with homeless persons, with addicted persons. We also administered the quality of life for hard-to-house individuals, which is a survey instrument developed through the World Health Organization, and it has been tweaked by some people at UBC for a more rural context. We did some interviews with homeless men and women. We also did interviews with outlying communities that may be contributing or sources of homeless persons. And we want to use personal narratives, biographies, etc. at the end of this, and that part I'll talk a little bit as we draw to an end, about what constitutes health and wellness in that community and how it might be, well, we're going to say regained. We don't know that it was ever there to begin with, but we're going to say that we're going to reestablish it. So I'll go through this pretty quick, I think. The people we first talked to were on the interview, on the interagency committee. Put together some focus questions for them, and out of those focus questions, you'll see we developed a focus group protocol for homeless persons themselves, because there's a close connection between the people in the IIC and the homeless persons. It's a very small community, and the homeless population is also quite small. So there is always a connection between those people, although not always positive. That's the other thing. We recruited the homeless persons primarily out of the shelter, because the ones who were available came from the shelter for us. And we had to go back, my initial plan, and of course I'm behind schedule, but geography and climate don't necessarily work the way the HRSDC and the CIHR wants them to. I couldn't do the research that I wanted to do at the time that I wanted to do it because the people were not in the town. When it's nicer, they disappear on the land. Given a gift card to participate in the research and for completing the quality of life survey. Now the QLHHI has what we call the MDS components of multiple discrepancy scales. And the interesting thing about this is that it's flexible, that we don't have to administer the whole survey. We can actually take elements of it without compromising its integrity. That said, that may have been sort of an exercise in utility at the end of the day anyway, but we chose housing, health, and social support. So the focus groups were the community members and the IIC, and then some specific focus groups with healthcare and the RCMP. And these are the questions that we asked them. I'm sure you can read, but just to highlight, what we're getting at here is what I call the breadth and scope of the problem. How much is it? How severe is it? How does it manifest itself? What kind of services are there? What services are used? And what could be offered as a response to it? It's all right, I can move on? So from that, we came up with this interview protocol for the focus groups. And they seem quite straightforward, but nothing is straightforward in research with people. We're very complicated and sometimes very frustrating. I'm not sure that we actually got through all of those questions, any of the groups that we had. We really tried, but we would get hung up quite easily. Actually, I was kind of thinking we might get hung up on what problems do you have. That wasn't the case at all. We got hung up on where do you go? That became the huge question. It became a research topic all of its own, but I, again, pushed that on the side, and we have the research agenda that we're supposed to be following through on. But how do you deal with the problems? What problems do you have? How have you been able to deal with them? Why or why not? That sort of thing. And that revealed some interesting results. Very quickly, some demographics for you. We had 18 people from the shelter. Interestingly, some of those people, as you'll see, they came from the shelter, but they actually weren't staying there. They showed up for dinner, but they weren't allowed to stay and they get kicked out. So, as far as migration goes, not that many people were from outside the community, and actually more migrants came from the south than from the north. And you figure, why would people want to migrate from Ontario to Inuvik? Money, because at one time there was a lot of money there when the oil and gas exploration was going on. Education-wise, there's a couple of people with college educations, very articulate. Maybe not the best managers of their lives. It's another word to put down for it. But half of them had some medical and physical disabilities, about half and half. And housing in the shelter, some with relatives, many with the RCMP, and a few on the street. I'll see what that means in a moment. So moving to the quality of life results. I was very disappointed at first when I started doing the analysis on this. These are non-standardized raw data. It's a small sample, and going through a lot of statistical gyrations may or may not have done something to make the information a little bit more useful. But basically what all of the information indicates here is that for the most part, people see their lives, their living situation, as somewhat normal. They're about mid-scale. These are just selected items here, but how do you feel about where you live? 4 out of 7. It's okay. What about where you want to live? Yeah, it's pretty close. I want some more, though. It'd be a little bit better. 5 years from now, what do you think? I think I'd like it to be a little better. Yeah, you know. Health, same thing. How do you feel about your health? I'm okay. 5 out of 7. What do you want? Oh, yeah, that's pretty good. 5 years from now, oh yeah, I'd probably, I don't know, I might be okay. Yeah, it's nothing spectacular. Social support, same thing. And like I say, at first I was quite disappointed by all of this. What's going on with this? These people are living, some of them are sleeping under buildings, or sleeping in what they call the utilidor, which is the above ground service duct for water, electricity, and sewage. They're crawling in these areas that they're insulated, right? They can't freeze, so they're warm. Well, how in the heck can they view themselves as having a good life, right? So, my initial working assumption now is that they view their situations as about average, but they're viewing it in the context of their social group. They're not viewing it from the context of the people who put together a survey who generally don't sleep in utilidors. My thinking, I'm just thinking that that's who's putting these surveys together. But the other thing is that with that context, that the focus groups provided us with a bit of a different view of what was happening, because we went from the statistical information, and of course there's also the other thing that maybe they're interpreting or understanding the questions incorrectly. all of them were somewhat literate, but they didn't have to read the questionnaire. We did have a sample, not a sample, a booklet that provides instructions, and in those instructions comes, rather than a 1 to 7, there might be a series of happy faces, or there might be a scale of a bar, like a bar graph, something like that, to give them a different context of what we mean by good or bad. So, quick look at the information that we had taken off of the transcripts. Disabilities, no consistent work history, very little in terms of vocation or education, with the exception of the couple of people who had been to college. High dependence on the Inuvik Housing Authority, which is a strange creature all of its own. It's somewhat surreal. They've been evicted for behavior problems usually, or being in arrears, and being in arrears is in the rent structure. They haven't been paying up. Many are waiting housing, and the shelter is used often, but so is the RCMP lockup. I think I have some more information on that coming up. Housing issues. Once people start working, they get nailed for paying more rent. So at the moment, they'd be paying $35 a month as an individual. If they start working, all of a sudden they're required to pay 35% of their income. And so if they were behind in other areas, that's almost like a punishment to many people. In fact, for short-term work, people won't go to work because for a month or two, the money that they make is almost canceled out by the amount that they have to pay back to the housing authority. And so it's a very strange situation. That's changed a lot, I have to say now. In the last year since I've been there, they have changed the fee structure, or what I call the penalty structure, that there's a maximum that they can be, I guess, charged. But some of the interesting things about being kicked out for parties, these are more benign types of reasons of being evicted, but there are some pretty harsh, what I would consider justifiable reasons for eviction too, like shooting your gun in the wall, that kind of thing. So once evicted, though, it's difficult to get in because there is a housing shortage, and generally at the moment there's roughly 45 people waiting to get into housing, 45 applications. So from the homeless person's perspective, housing, hard to get in. Hard to get back in once you're kicked out. They put you on a blacklist. And I have a hard time asking my brother and sisters to stay overnight. That's the other thing. If you have been evicted and you manage to work your way into your brother's or sister's place to stay, and the housing authority figures that out, your brothers and sisters are now evicted. It's a domino effect. So that's what that particular quote's all about. It was minus 35 and I let somebody in. Of course, there are other options for this person too. He can say, the RCMP is still there, you can go there, but rather than turn the person away when it was cold, they let them in. Getting evicted, not as important as saving someone's life. And this is not that uncommon because there's quite a few stories of people with no fingers and no toes from frostbite. We owe arrears. Most of our families stay in housing. We can't stay there. We're happy to get a roof over our head, but we don't know. Better than being in the cold. Moving on. And this is one of the cases where the person was having to pay $1,750 a month rent after starting a job. What happens, though, is that most of these people don't pay it. And when they don't pay it, it accumulates in debt. And the debt keeps mounting. There's interest charged on it. There's one family actually, that owed $100,000 in arrears. And the person would not go in to make negotiations for it because he was too ashamed. It was a no-win situation. He would not go represent himself, but at the same time, the machine kept working along and calculating interest, and The more he stayed away, the worse it got. And if you arrears, getting back in is very difficult. The RCMP, this is interesting, small detachment, well, I guess it's not that small, but 15 people, I think. Many people go to jail to get out of the cold. Some will break the law. When I was there, actually, I saw it happen. This one guy laid down in front of the doors of the main store, the North Mart, and just waited for the police to come and get him. Others just knock on the door in the middle of the night if it's really cold. And so far, the police have been accommodating, but they are stretched themselves budget-wise, and they now have to hold them only a minimum or a maximum of 8 hours because they cannot feed them anymore. That we used to be at one time they would give them some food. 2,500 missions yearly in a town of 3,300 on average. Most of those charges obviously don't go forward. They're community support, not much in the community. According to them, apparently there is an AA meeting, but people ignore it because it's held in the Anglican Church, and there's a little bit of history there between the church and the people. So if there's any kind of historical abuse that the person's experienced, or their family, or maybe they don't like listening to the pastor because that's who runs the AA meeting, they won't go. Going out for treatment sometimes helps, sometimes it doesn't. This one fellow had treatment that didn't work. If you want and you're eligible for treatment, the closest facility is in Hay River to the Inuvik, and next one's Edmonton. Mental health treatment, if it's needed, as far as in-house services or in-house treatment, is usually Edmonton or Vancouver. The shelter, people are kicked out during the day. At 10 o'clock, the shelter closes. There's not enough budget to keep it open. There's no support groups, and generally what people do is they go to the library. The library's become the daytime shelter, and the nighttime shelter is this one, or the lockup. A lot of people did appreciate the shelter being a dry environment, that it helped. This one fellow thought it helped him build up his resistance and to get straight. What might work, there's a big call for volunteers because they know there's no money. Even the homeless people know there's no money, so what they'd like to do is have volunteer mentors help them, the ones who are able to articulate that. Counseling, if possible, they'd also like to see. Although many of them, they say they've tried it and it hasn't worked too well. But then again, the mentor model is a bit different. So, why are the contradictions? Participants are more stable when they're in the shelter, and they're judging themselves on where they are as opposed to where they were, and that can lead to the disparity and to the statistical results that we found. The other thing is that maybe the quality of life instrument is not the best tool for homeless person in rural northern communities. It was the only instrument that has been used before, though. Originally, I'd intended to use the SF 36, social functioning 36, but it had even less application in rural and northern communities. Current reality for the hard to house, as I'm calling them now. Roughly 90% abuse alcohol, about anywhere from 25 to 50% of them abuse other illicit substances. There's one community I have a picture of here at the end of the show. I'll show you that for the most part doesn't have an alcohol problem at all. They import bales of marijuana. That's a different drug of choice. Mental health is affecting 25% of them that we know of. The dry shelter doesn't serve all of the hard to house because if you show up with alcohol in your breath or any other kind of intoxication, you're not allowed to come in. The housing policies don't serve the interests of many people. at least in this group, and the situation is not looking like it's going to change much. In fact, it looks like it's going to get worse just because of the amount of cutbacks and of funding is concerned. So, where to go from here? One approach is called the continuum of housing, and that, there's a bunch of assumptions, but the idea of ownership being at the top of the scale, owning a home in that particular community is a pretty expensive venture. Most people rent. There are some private homeowners, but a lot of the homes are owned by the housing authority. So, starting with absolute homelessness, going to a shelter, having transitional housing or public housing. Transitional housing or public housing is what we'll also refer to as supportive housing, and that is the push that I would be making here as to what that would look like. Because the continuum of housing has a lot of assumptions, and the big one is that there's services available. For people to actually be able to participate in what we'll call domestic lifestyle, however we want to define that, they actually need to be stable. To do that, they generally need services. And that also assumes community capacity, which is not there. There's a lot of community will, however. I mean, there's a lot of very, very interested people wanting to help. And it also assumes that the hard to house have the capacity and the willingness, which we don't always necessarily have. So our model here now is current reactive model. It's basically working on what I call the whole context there, and the whole situation is called triage. For those of you who know the term, it's a triage model. I mean, where's the bleeding artery? Well, we'll plug that one. Well, where's the broken spine? Let's deal with that one. It's the same thing with people who are broken, but not necessarily physically broken. It's just triage, quick fix, moving on next. It results in high burnout for the people working in the area, and is very low in satisfaction for the people receiving any kind of help or looking for help, and it's not very effective. Supportive housing. This model, going to the very bottom bullet point there, requires what they call a housing first approach. The housing first approach is something that's emerged in about the last 5 years, at least on our radar. It's probably been around a bit longer in the US, but that suggests that regardless of where people are at in their lives, regardless of what their situations are, regardless of what their behaviors are, everyone is guaranteed housing. So if you're 24/7 high or drunk, whatever, it doesn't matter, you still deserve a place to live. In that, though, are the abilities for people to actually make changes in their lives and to assist in the development of supportive structures and services for people like them. We know that some people don't have the capacity really to take care of themselves. We know that from our situation in the urban setting. We know that some people, however, do have capacity and have given the tools and the chances and the support they can actually contribute to their own well-being and the well-being of others. And we see that all the time, even in our downtown Victoria area. It's inclusive of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultures because it's going down to a common denominator level of need rather than status. But it does require an integrated team of stakeholders that have the abilities and the resources. So, it's similar to a harm reduction model, and as such, it accepts the reality of people who are hard to house. And it's the term that's come up now is called assertive community treatment, and that's very much the outreach model with the idea of having mentors as well. The motivational interviewing component of it is part of that assertiveness in community treatment. And the motivational interviewing is really nothing more than helping people identify what they need and to develop strategies for them to get it. So it is to be a builder of self-esteem and self-ability. It does imply several levels of housing that are needed, and there are a couple of examples that are underway in this country and the US at the moment. In rural Ontario, Wellington, the model taken is is that housing is, I guess, a right kind of approach, that everyone is entitled to housing, and with that, they've been able to implement changes to the development and delivery of services and the improvement of people's general life conditions who are participating in the project. Rural New York has the same type of approach up in the Appalachian area. And Whitehorse, I stumbled across this, I call it the serendipity moment, that for those of you who have heard Habitat for Humanity, they've actually joined with a couple of First Nations groups there to produce some houses in a community for families. So it's not specifically focused on addictions or mental health, but it has brought together that cooperation model, right? And because it's focused on low-income families, it's considered to be a preventative approach. So again, moving away from the triage model. So these are questions I actually posed to the groups up there. What do they want to do? Do they want to stick with the status quo? Do they want to try to look at some kind of housing model that has aggressive assertive community treatment? Do they want to look at a partnership model? But the big one that comes up for me, just in observations from the outside, is the lack of NGOs. There are roughly two churches and a mosque in Inuvik. And other than that shelter, there is nothing. There is no Salvation Army, there is no John Howard Society, no Elizabeth Fry Society, nothing. And those agencies fill a big need, or fill a gap in towns south of them, like Yellowknife and Whitehorse. Both of those communities have very active Salvation Army units, and they're very effective. At the moment, both of those are also dry, which has that limitation to it, but they're also providing more on-site counseling and addictions treatment, and they are very good at working with agencies like a hospital for getting services to people who need it, who may not know how to go about getting it themselves. But
it's closed.
It's closed, yes. That was the original residential school in the area. Sir Alexander Mackenzie. Not necessarily hated by all, though. This is the community that I was saying had the marijuana predilection. I won't name it, but it's sitting right out in the middle of the Beaufort Sea, has a population of about 125. And this is taken from the RCMP house I was standing behind. Which, by the way, oops, that's me at the barbecue in the wintertime. So you have that contrast with this sort of more urban, quasi-urban setting. You know, if I go back to this, those are some of the people are coming from, and they go to this. They go through their own culture shock as well. Yeah. That's it anyway, so I'm happy to take some questions if you have any.
Michael, I was delighted to see your solutions at the end, because other than your stunning revelations about human nature in your interviews with homeless people, I think that this is such a pervasive problem in the North, housing in general. And so I was glad to see that your recommendations did include housing in general, not just housing for homeless, because housing in the North is a disaster. And but my question is really, did you find that there was a strong link between the general quality of housing and the homelessness issue in NWT? It's a have and have-not society, so I think you're dealing really with a good proportion of the population, not just the homeless.
Yeah, and I think that the impoverished there, and I guess the thing, you know, you back up into a little bit more of the political and the economic context, it's worse when there's money in the town, believe it or not, because the companies come into town and they will book all of the hotels, they will rent all of the buildings that they can rent, whether or not there's people staying in them, just in case they need it for their workers. It's really a lose-lose in that particular context, but the majority of the people there either work for the government or on government subsidy at the moment. That's it. There are two pay scales.
It's the same thing.
All depends how you look at it, I guess.
Level of subsidy by the government, but it's, if you work for the government, you're on, a polite form of welfare.
Really?
Well, dependency.
Yeah. I guess the question for the North is always going to be, do they want to maintain the populations there because of humanistic purposes, or is it basically a maple leaf stamp? Because the
Resource extraction.
the bay that I showed you here, that was where the Russian freighter that was illegally taken up landed. Brian.
Hi, Michael. I was interested in your comment that some of your respondents weren't available during some seasons because they were out on the land. And I wondered if you had a chance to explore that. I wondered, are they functional in that environment? Are they welcome with family and friends? And are there lessons that can be learned from that experience that can be applied?
Yeah, and that becomes quite a rub, because there are those people who do well when they get out on the land. They get a chance to basically stay in the cabins. I mean, the cabins they have, they build along the river on the delta. They fish, they hunt, pretty much become self-sufficient. They may not even have the family's permission to do that, or the family's property, but they may have the property of someone else who say, I'm not using the cabin, go ahead. So that's a possibility, but they also know that they can't sustain that as a lifestyle. And so at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, when they come back off the land, then they're back to, they can actually be sober for 4 months, and within a month back in town are sleeping under a building. So in that sense, the quick fix isn't to put them back on the land. But it does seem that part of the importance of being attached to the land can't be underestimated. I hope we've answered your question, but it is really dicey, because it is that pull and that strength that they get, but they know that they can't maintain it as a lifestyle. Yep.
Building on that, Michael, I mean, we know from other research in other communities that link between, particularly in Aboriginal communities, between culture and more investment in culture and better outcomes in terms of all kinds of range of health things and housing, etc. And I'm also thinking of your project here, and I can't remember the name of it, but the farm.
Woodland Farms.
Woodland Farms, yeah. And just wondering whether that was a place that you explored, when you were looking at the housing options, I didn't see it represented there, but that idea of connecting, which is not about just sort of sending people onto the land and saying, that's the solution, but here's a way of developing some skills, maybe reconnecting to culture, reconnecting to other possibilities in a space that's supported. And I wondered if that option had been explored, or whether you were thinking about that, because it seems sort of like a fit.
I actually have taken it off. I did have a transitional housing perspective built into this, but what I've been trying to do is keep this true to the agenda of the funders, but thinking along the terms of the therapeutic community. Really, all that is a microcosm of the community around it. So it does make perfect sense from my thinking that that could be self-organized, and all that's needed is the space to do it. So yeah, I agree, and the whole idea of the therapeutic community is for people to actually become socialized or re-socialized based on a model that will meet their needs. And so in that case, it makes perfect sense.
And so many of the things that you were describing, the profile really is not, other than the harshness of the climate, is no different than the profile of homelessness in many urban centers and in many rural centers in terms of the kind of characteristics you were describing. But it does seem like that connection to a different possibility of living that it includes housing but other things would be a solution worth exploring.
Well, and I guess the interesting thing about the therapeutic community model is, as we envision it here, is that it's a responsibility-based model. It's not a flop house.
Right.
It's not a shelter. You just don't go there to eat. You actually, if you go, you commit to
Well,
being
you become
engaged.
part of a community.
Exactly.
A working member of part of a community, as
That's right.
opposed to somebody getting a handout or a service or whatever, which is very
Right.
different. Right?
So basically, it's supposed to be self-maintaining
Yeah.
once it's actually organized and running correctly.
I just, probably a really simple question, but you mentioned that rents were like, some of them were $1,750 a month. That seems really high. Why are rents so high? Particularly if once people get into those houses, they can't actually afford to pay the rent, they go in arrears. It doesn't benefit the people who are probably renting the properties out either, that there's such high arrears. It certainly doesn't benefit the people who have to pay those rents. So what's that kind of model based on? I don't really get it.
Yeah, simple question. Any preface like that, I know it's coming with both barrels. It's not that the rents start that high. I can't remember what the starting scale is, but once you have been living under the subsidized model for a period of time and you get work, you then are charged a percentage of your income. So the $1,750 was what that fellow was charged once he got his job, once he started working. So it was based on a sliding scale. So if you earn $3,000 a month, you're going to pay $1,000 a month rent. If you earn $4,000, $1,500, et cetera, et cetera. So it's aimed at around the 30-35% mark. They have, in the last 8 months or 10 months, put a cap on that so that people who do get a job don't get most of their money taken away just for the rent part of it. That does not take care, however, of the arrears. And at the moment, that particular issue is still being dealt with because it's, as I said, for people who haven't been working very much, they get a job and then all of a sudden they're being pushed to pay back arrears and pay the rent. So basically they end up working like we do for nothing. Right? All the money comes in the left hand, it leaves on the right hand. And that's, in that context, given the circumstances of the lives and the traditions that have built in that place, is not seen as fair. Whether we see it as fair or not, it doesn't matter, but yeah.
No, well, firstly, can I apologise for my coal-induced confusing interjection earlier? I'm not trying to draw a parallel between working for the government and being on welfare. Obviously, you're better off if you work for the government. The parallel I was drawing is that neither group is there through their independent initiative. I mean, if all the people who live there either work for the government or are on welfare, the whole community exists because of the government. And I find that quite an interesting phenomenon. Presumably, the solution is to get some people to break out of dependency on government or welfare in some shape or form. I suppose I come from this in as much as I'm as sceptical of dependency on the state as I am as the impact of the market on people's lives. I think I'm sceptical of terms like therapeutic community as it happens, because I think it just creates a new relationship to the state. It puts you in it. So my naive question is this: what would happen if you just built a house there? I mean, is it that all the land belongs to the state and you can't do it and they tear it down, or you know what?
Fall apart very quickly. Like it's a very harsh climate, so everything gets destroyed extraordinarily quickly, isn't it? Like,
Well, maintenance is a big factor.
But there are homes there.
Yes,
So what's preventing people from just building new ones?
Capital.
Huh?
capital. Capital is the big thing. There's the only house building that's going on now is being done by the territorial government. And the
Would
last
that
thing,
not be the best solution, rather than create a new dependency on welfare handouts and categorizations of addiction, and which just puts you in a new relationship to the state?
well, I guess I don't look at it from the perspective of a political economy, because if we go back even historically to the last 100 years, we've gone through a forced assimilation process, and even though we don't use the term now, it's still happening. The forced assimilation is still there because we created the situation and the structures for people to have to live in that context to survive, whereas before they did not have to live in that urban or rural, quasi-urban context to survive. So that's I guess aside from the political economy, I don't know if there's any easy way out just by building homes. Because you
Isn't
still,
labeling someone as addicted or in need of mental health support just a polite form of, what you just described, of assimilation? Exactly. Sorry, I've got a cold and I'm not thinking straight, but it's just.
yeah, I wouldn't say.
I'm forcing you into
I can't answer it. I can't answer it because I don't really know.
By categorizing you, by labeling you, ultimately, presumably, people don't want to be labeled in need of mental support and, various other services.
Absolutely.
And the only breakout of that, is to, separate totally from that relationship somehow.
Well, I think that's,
I'll shut up.
no, well, given the amount of time and effort that's gone into pulling those relationships together and trying to participate together as communities, moving from that kind of forced assimilation, sort of ethno-genocidal approach to what we have now, which is, I want to say the word cooperative communities, that would just push back the other direction. So labeling or not labeling, we're still going to end up with polarized communities. And those communities cannot afford to be polarized. They will not survive. They know that. They tell me that. It's not me speaking, that's them. They say, we need each other. There's no way around that.
Yeah, even the stage is a problematic concept in NWT. They have 7 different governments, basically. However, my question is more the cultural paradox of people being homeless in the NWT. It is a total cultural paradox. And my work on Arctic social indicators reveals that the quality of life in NWT is going down, not because of material or health or education factors, but because of lack of contact with the natural world, lack of fate control, people not having control over their own destiny, and lack of cultural integrity. And so it strikes me this is at the heart of what you're looking at in NWT, because it's just such a disaster.
Yeah, and the people there call it the conditions for the perfect storm.
Yeah.
They're stealing it from the movie, but that's the term they use.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Were they reluctant to talk to you, to open up?
I think they were puzzled. They were puzzled. And after the discussions got going a little bit about, once the housing authority issues came up, it was more of a free-flowing conversation. But the first part, again, the survey, and I know as an outsider, a survey is going to be about as welcome as a cold, right? But that's where the relationship building at the beginning helped to bridge those well, they're not really gaps, but they're communication tools, right? Just having that free flow of information was easier having done the pre-work for it.
You mentioned that there isn't really any NGO structure there. Did you come across any reasons for that? Not to mention the Salvation Army, were they there at some place and left, or were they just never there?
They were never there.
Would there be any ways, or as part of your recommendations, to try to encourage?
I hope so. That's on my list for sure. Yeah. There is the person in Whitehorse I talked to is quite keen on talking to his the captain or whatever. They use that military structure, but he's quite keen on communicating that issue. Jean.
2 questions. Just to help me understand the context a bit more. You talked about the Nunavut Housing Authority. I'm trying to understand, and you said very few people own, a lot of people rent. So in terms of the housing stock that's available, is the rental stock primarily with the housing authority or is it private?
Both.
Who owns property there?
There's a bit of, I think about 20% is private and
Okay.
80% is owned by the territory.
And so the 80% is owned by the territory in terms of the housing stock, right? Okay, and so they're the ones who then control, have these rules around the rent and how much you pay. all of those people?
They have a large bureaucracy that takes care of that.
And then when you talked about where people came from and the incidents of homelessness is occurring, that, as you described it, was in Inuvik. It wasn't talking about the other communities that they came from. What was the homelessness also present in those locations, or did you have this place-based?
The original thinking that we had, and this came from the interagency committee itself, was that there was concern that people were coming from the outside communities because there was not even a shelter. Once they had problems, and they would have to leave the community, and they would end up in Inuvik. So it's not that the problems don't exist in those communities, but the communities are small enough that they don't have any resources. So once you've worn out your welcome with your relatives and your friends, you pretty much have to leave. And Inuvik's the first choice because there are more services there.
Okay, one last question. You said that you had taken out the other model, the therapeutic community model.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about why you chose to take? You briefly talked about that, but just speak.
The transitional housing approach. I was originally, and this actually was not just my idea as far as transitional housing goes, that comes from the Inuvik Interagency Committee, but given the fact that the resources for building anything are not there, I backed away from that, given the parameters of the funding for the project. However, I plan to build it back because we've been, again, the committee has been quite energetic with identifying buildings right now that are in disrepair and not being used that could be transformed into some kind of service house. And one of those is the old youth center. So yes, yeah.
I'm just curious, did they explore the option of reopening the residential school for housing purposes?
They've talked about it, but the size of it is too big. It's huge. So whether they want to open part of it, I don't know. There's talk of it actually being flattened.
Why?
Because it's an eyesore and cultural reminder of a lot of pain for people.
Well, it could be transformed into a positive rather than
It could, yes.
still have that negative connotation of.
Yes, you're right. And not everybody has that negative connotation either of that school
It could
particularly.
be turned into a healing house of some sort.
And
And-
Alert Bay did that.
Alert Bay.
Alert Bay took their residential school and made it into all band offices and all things like that, and some housing. It was amazing.
Yeah, I'd be interested. At the moment, that the last I heard, the plan was to flatten it. But there are other buildings in town that would fit that need as well, though, because they did build a new youth center, and the old youth center is probably large enough to accommodate most, if not all, of the homeless population. That's accommodatable that can be dealt with. So yeah, there's options there. It's just a matter of raw dollars. Like I said, the will is there. The people are very, very keen. There isn't even enough. There's not even enough resources for training for people to serve that role of mentor, etc. So, but the will is there, and it's coming slowly. This research, and I guess the sort of finished up there, the benefit of this research being third party, it's the first of its kind, that it can't be shelved. So when reports due at the end of June that I produce, it doesn't have to go into a shelf somewhere in a bureaucrat's office. The first copies go to the IIC and to the communities that I visited. Yeah.
Thank you for your work. This work reminds us a lot of the experience we've had with the homeless work here in Victoria as well. Having worked on reserve and then with homeless populations in Victoria, very similar things, not entirely obviously. But we talked about cultural reconnection, and sometimes it's very essentializing to say we'll reconnect them with the culture, but then when you go into the culture and say which culture are we talking about, and it's often about family as opposed to the culture. And so I just wonder, in the proportion of homeless persons, what is the cultural mix in terms of geography, in terms of average and non-average, and where is the family in all of this? And with some of the work that's been done here too, like the idea of reconnecting the culture is about reconnecting to your name and your spirituality, who you are as a person, and sometimes it triggers a whole reawakening of, actually, I'm a chief's daughter or son, and that reawakens a certain sense of identity, and that seems to be a very helpful thing to shift and turn people. So in other words, you work towards creating an environment where this is possible, that shift is possible. And it's very hard to orchestrate the shift, obviously, but you create an environment where it's more likely to happen.
Well, the family is always in the background in all of the stuff that we've been doing. The family's always there. It's either as a block or a resistance or a barrier that they do not want people to come back, or they have sort of what we call reciprocal but not consistent relations depending on the behavior of the people involved. As far as cultural awakening goes, or cultural even raising awareness, that part is probably the strongest thing that the communities have going for it. There's two dominant cultures there, though, Gwich'in and Innu Valley. So there's enough motivation and emphasis on that, which is why the connection to the land is probably as strong as it is still now. The one conversation I had with an elder about that is that they're very nervous that people want to basically give up and go back to where they think they've come from because it doesn't exist anymore. So there's a bit of resistance about that too. They say that's the noble savage Pollyanna mentality does not exist anymore. We know that, but we still need the connection to the land. We still need the connection with the people. So they're quite aware of what that means. But again, as far as doing something about it, that seems to be where it's more difficult.
I know you need to wrap up, but I wonder if in your report you're going to also include, having gone out to some of the feeder communities or whatever, however your framing goes, and you yourself labeled some of this as the reactive stance, which is the reactive stance of health care as well. Regardless of whether there's money to do it or whether anyone's going to do it, but this idea that trying to address building and enhancing healthy communities so that they're not feeding, so that people are not in that position of having no other option or no other perceived option than going to Inuvik for, that life. Will that also be part, did you explore that with the ICC and also in your research to be able to speak to that part of putting resources, whatever that looks like, into the community before you end up with people homeless?
Probably in those terms, but not much more detail. I think that would be the next step. As far as feeder or contribution community is concerned, that's only one element of the so-called problem, and what I can recommend at this point is not much, based on my visits to those communities.
So this is your next CIA program.
Maybe. Thanks. Thanks everybody for sticking around.